point of this conversation, like this is my passion, my love is for training, kind of blending training with rehab and performance. So I want you guys to kind of ask me any questions that are pertain to your practice or kind of like what you deal with on a daily basis. I could talk about weightlifting, I could talk about powerlifting, I could talk about a lot of these things that interest me, but I want to make this call about you guys. So let me kind of lead it off by starting like, what are some things that you find yourself struggling with, say from like your current setting or things that you want to learn more about in regards to kind of like training and performance? Is there anything that comes to mind? Who wants to be brave?
I do have a question, and I don't know if it wholly fits within that thing, but like you did a podcast a while ago for like AMP education, and you mentioned with students that usually they'll do like these evals, make a great plan of care, but where they tend to struggle is like finding that initial safe starting point
Mhm.
with the patients. And so at my clinic, like 80-90% of the population I see is like hypermobile patients. And their presentation can be kind of all over the place depending on like how severe it is and how many years they've been dealing with issues. I found like some success. Like I mentioned, I was doing breathing things. Like I do kind of like compression expansion stuff as like a starting point, just to give them some like light core engagement, like postural awareness, things like that. But like beyond that, just in a general sense, like how do you find that safe starting point for your patients, regardless of presentation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that's something we all struggle with. So I actually had a patient literally when I left the clinic today who I kind of had trouble figuring out like where do I start this person. So like my general like rules of thumb or like where I go to first is I outwardly ask them. I was like, what have you been doing recently, or like what are you familiar with? So it's your decision in that circumstance will be very different if it's someone who already trains like 5 days a week versus someone who hasn't done any sort of regimented fitness program in their entire life. So I always try to get an idea of like how active is this person? Like some people don't go to the gym, but they're very active. Like they kayak, they hike, they do all sorts of outdoor activities. So I try to get an idea of just like generally what are they already doing? And then of course, what do they want to be able to do more of? So in your circumstance, if you're dealing with people that are very hypermobile, oftentimes they're I'm trying not to be stereotypical, but a lot of people that I've worked with that are hypermobile, they still feel the need to stretch all the time. And I think many of us have had these experiences where it's like people that the stereotype would be like are yogis or people that already have like an 120-degree straight leg raise, and they're like, oh, my hamstrings feel really tight. And you're just kind of like, you don't need that, right? So for that person, my entry point is going to be very different. I'm going to try to find ways for them to learn how to develop stiffness. Right. So that's my primary goal with them. How I do that is based on like what tools I have access to and what the person wants to do. Like if this is somebody who already likes doing yoga type activities, I will probably give them some really prolonged iso holds, but I'll put them in super challenging positions where they have to learn how to work in a shortened state because that's just what they're not good at doing. Right. They're always looking for that end range. So that's kind of like where I'd approach that. The alternative end of the equation, I've had people that already train, like my current setting, we work with a lot of athletes and baseball players. So these kids are already training 4, 5, 6 times a day, or sorry, 6 times a week. So sometimes I'm like, well, I don't want to give this person more of a training stimulus because they just won't recover from it. So some of the time I have to give them either something recovery oriented, like dynamic mobility, or maybe just give them more like lower level, like more prolonged ISOs or extensive plyo type work that they can recover quickly from and do a very small volume of, because that's going to be helpful for where they are now. So like to go back to your original question, like entry point is a matter of like figure out where they are now, where is their ideal endpoint, and based on what they prefer doing, like what are logical ways that you can build them up to that point. And I think that's kind of training in a nutshell, right? Like a lot of people come to you, the initial eval is kind of scary because you don't really know anything about this person. So on the fly, you have to kind of make some assumptions and say, okay, based on what this person is telling me, based on my experiences, how can I help them get to where they want to be? And I think that's tough, right? Like I think we all struggle with that at numerous points across our typical caseload. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think that is something that like Corey kind of mentioned too, like that module two with the different phases of rehab. Because I asked her kind of similar question, like when I have a patient presentation, how like because they're hypermobile with chronic pain, like it constantly shifts because the common complaint is PT really works, but they focus on the one spot, but then it kind of shifts and spreads and never really addresses like their overall like dysfunction or pain. And it's just like an interesting like thing because kind of like I mentioned, like I've had a spectrum of like extremely hypermobile, lots of chronic pain, like subluxing like crazy, like just looking at them, versus like I just have a lot of back pain because my pelvis is really hypermobile, but everything else is like kind of like a normal stiff presentation.
Mhm.
And just finding that safe entry point is just like some people it feels easier, some people it feels harder, and it's just kind of like everything you said is kind of like things I try to take in considerations, but sometimes just trying to like figure out the most ideal at the time can still be kind of
Yeah.
challenging for me.
So if we take it like from a more of like an exercise standpoint, because everything you just said is perfectly valid. But if you take it from an exercise standpoint, like what is the quote unquote like safest place to start with some of these clients? Like where does your brain go first? If it's somebody who is like very apprehensive or they have like pain obviously is very subjective, but say it's somebody who's very apprehensive and very fearful of movement, like what kind of activities would you typically start that person with?
Again, depending if they were like highly active, but a lot of my clients that I see are like, I want to say like middle age or older, like paying on like 20, 30, 40 years, whatever. Honestly, like a lot of like breathing in different positions, like supine sidling. I do like that because it's like I said, it's very light core engagement, teaching them how to engage the core in a very like unconscious manner. Like you're not trying to force them to do anything. They're getting some like relative joint motion in like the thorax, like spine. And you just kind of giving them some postural awareness. If you kind of like if you do a PRI like a ZOA, just learning to bring like the ribs closer to the pelvis, because a lot of them I see are this like this hyperlordotic, really uncomfortable posture. Teach them to engage the core, get them in a position that's more like that middle that you kind of talked about. Um, and then from there, just try to build out, just get them comfortable with like moving and just being aware of their body to some degree. And I do like isometrics, like that's been a really good game changer for me for a lot of things. And depending on what they need, if it's more like upper body, lower body, I just kind of play around with that and see what works for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great answer. Like, I think one of the questions I kind of have for the whole group, like I wrote up a couple things that I want to make sure I cover, and obviously we'll intersperse the questions. So one question I have for all of you guys, if I can find where I put that, give me 1 second. So what is the overall point of any sort of training or exercise? Like, what's our ultimate goal? What are we trying to accomplish? So I think you kind of have to start with the end in mind. It's like any sort of training or any sort of exercise and fitness. Why do we do it? Like, what are we trying to achieve? There's no wrong answers. I promise.
I think it varies depending on the person. Like some people have a goal in terms of activity, like I want to be ready for X, Y, and Z. I feel like my most challenging one in terms of like prescribing training is like I just want my pain to stop, because
Yep.
then you have no like end point, and you as a PT have to like decide what you want this person to be doing. And I feel like that is where I struggle, at least. Sorry to answer your question with another problem, but
Most questions we ask have another question. So like, and I think that speaks very well to like what Andrew was just talking about. I think if someone's only focused on pain goals, and we have all dealt with this, it becomes very challenging because the only thing they're fixated on is how they are feeling, which is very subjective and changes day to day based on a number of factors that we cannot control. So to your point, Kayla, it's like ideally you give them something like functional or some kind of activity-based goal. But the problem is if they don't offer anything to you or they don't really care about anything, then that becomes even more challenging. Because like it sounds terrible. Like if you're putting in more than they're putting in, like it's not going to be a good situation. So it's kind of like you need to dig deeper and say, like, well, what are things that you'd like to do more of? Or before you had this pain, what were you doing? Like, would you like to get back to that? Because then you start to get like you need to be mindful, of course, pain and how they're feeling, but you need to give them some sort of goalposts that are a little bit more tangible and that they can see little gains towards. Because we've all had people, it's like they're doing great and they have one day where they have a setback, and all of a sudden pain is like all they can think about, but they forgot about all of the other physical progress they made leading up to that point. So it's kind of like you need to, in many cases, like we're acting as a consultant who's supposed to be more unbiased. So we have to kind of give them a fresh perspective and almost like reframe the situation for them to give them an idea of what they're looking for, like what they're working towards. And I think like coaching is the same way, right? I think there's a lot of interplay between rehab and coaching, right? All good coaches have to do the same thing with their athletes all the time. Like imagine your athlete is otherwise healthy, but they're going through a performance rut. So you've got to figure out like, how do I get this athlete back on track? How do I get them feeling more confident or get their mind back in the game? That's the same thing that we do on a daily activity or daily basis with a lot of our clients, right? Who else has some ideas of like, why else do we train? What's the point of exercise? You can think of,
I mean,
go ahead. Sorry.
All right, like physical adaptation, right?
Mhm.
So just like basic change of the body, which leads into function, right? Building more muscle will lead into more, um, like better functioning movement, smoother movement, more efficient movement. That sit to stand is no longer someone's 1 RM, right? Like,
Yep.
I think that's kind of our overall goal. If every time someone stands up, it's 90% of their effort. If we can make that less, it's just going to be, they're just going to be a higher functioning individual. I think that's kind of the root, is just a physical change.
Yep. Yeah, like I love, like you use the term like adaptation. Like ultimately we're trying to drive some kind of adaptation. Now, like to kind of bring things full circle, there's certain types of adaptations that might be more neurological, right? So if you're teaching somebody a new skill or they're doing something for the first time and they haven't done it in forever, like I'm sure all of you have gotten somebody back to return to run and they haven't done it in like 3 or 4 or 5 months. And the first couple times they do it, they're just like, wow, I feel like I've never run before, right? But within like the same session, all of a sudden they feel better. Like, are we driving an adaptation with that? I mean, kind of, but not like not like a physical adaptation. That's really just like coordination and sequencing, which gets better very quickly. So like a lot of training, like most of the time, we're trying to drive long-term adaptations. So those would be like you mentioned maximal strength. What other types of like physiological adaptations can training elicit? Like what are we trying to work towards? So you got maximal strength. What else?